Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and I'm here today to talk to you about Spirit of Yorkshire Filey Bay Peated Finish Batch 2. Now Batch 1 was my whisky of the year last year. I announced it in early December with a view of selling it over the Christmas period as an absolutely amazing whisky, and at the point basically that I released the video, they ran out of stock. So the couple of bottles I had left sold and there was nothing left, but we now have a batch 2. What I do have as well is a sample bottle of the batch 2, but I actually have a little bit left of the batch, when I can find it without dropping it, batch 1. So what I'm going to do is do a side by side between the two, because I love the first one. I love that kind of slightly sweet, soft, smoky complexity that was there, and it'd be really interesting to see with slightly older stock, and as you'll find out, not much difference between the casks that they did the finish in, whether there is a marked difference. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it just the same? Was there any point in them doing a second batch, etc, etc. But before we go into that, let me give you a bit of background information, if you weren't aware already, about the Spirit of Yorkshire distillery and also what happens in this peated finish. The Spirit of Yorkshire distillery was founded in 2016 by Tom Mellor and David Thompson. Tom was an arable farmer who set up the Wold Top Brewery in 2013 and already had ideas about opening a whisky distillery in conjunction, and so partnered with long-standing friend and marketing expert David to set up the new Spirit venture. The barley used for both beer and whisky production is grown on Tom's own fields, with milling, mashing and fermentation taking place at the brewery 4.5 miles away from the distillery itself. If the distillery was in Scotland, this would not be allowed due to Scotch Whisky Association regulations. In planning the distillery, Tom and David enlisted the help of legendary distillery consultant Jim Swan, who was well known around the world for assisting new distilleries such as Cavallan, Kilchoman, Penderyn and Lindores Abbey before his untimely death in 2017. The house style will ultimately be akin to the likes of Glenlivet, fruit forward but somewhat delicate in body. The master distiller is a young man named Joe Clark. Joe's first job in the whisky industry was as a part-timer in the York branch of the Whisky Shop, at that time managed by none other than yours truly. His passion and enthusiasm was obvious from the very start, and he has worked tirelessly to ensure the early spirit releases from the distillery, under the brand name of Filey Bay, are of the highest quality. However, as is a legal requirement whenever I discuss Joe, I am obliged to show you this picture of Joe with our good friend Ollie Chilton of the Whisky Exchange during a trip to Islay. Feel free to ask him about the long hair, it's quite the story. In addition to 2 copper pot stills, a directional arm can connect to a 4-plate column still, which enables them to play around with reflux and redistillation. Maturation takes place principally in first fill ex-bourbon casks from Old Forester, although plenty of experimentation has been done with other cask types and finishing. Indeed, the current core range features a finish using Muscatel wine casks and an STR ex-Rioja cask finish. STR, or shaved, toasted and recharred, is a signature of Jim Swan's legacy. Filey Bay flagship, however, can be seen as the key introduction to the Filey Bay flavour profile, with light, fruity and creamy notes throughout. Unlike other recent new whisky distilleries across the UK, Spirit of Yorkshire never had any intention to delve into the massive gin or growing rum market, which would have given them an early and potentially lucrative revenue stream. The only concession they've made was the release of a whisky and malt spirit cream liqueur at the end of 2020, allowing visitors to their distillery who didn't drink whisky the chance to still appreciate their output. Spirit of Yorkshire don't use peat during the malting process, so the only way to introduce some kind of smoky flavour profile is to finish their whisky in casks that have previously held some kind of peated spirit. They Peated Finish Batch 2 uses casks sourced from an Islay distillery that is also a field to glass operation and the source of the barrels used in the inaugural Batch 1 release, and which may have also been mentioned earlier in this video. As before, it's not a specific partnership between Spirit of Yorkshire and the distillery in question, it just happens to be these were the best casks Joe could lay his hands on at the time of looking. Whereas Batch 1 used spirit that had been aged for around 3 to 3.5 years before the finish, Batch 2 uses slightly older stock of around 4 to 4.5 years old. No colour is added, no chill filtration takes place, and it's bottled at 46% ABV. Okay, so I'm going to pour the samples. This is the Peated Finish Batch 1, the first one that came out last year. So as you're now aware, we are still using the same distillery for the peated finish. So it's the casks that have come from Kilchoman, which is more of a slightly ashy style, is a kind of like house style of Kilchoman. It's slightly more ashy smokiness rather than that medicinal style that you might find from the likes of Lefroy, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, that sort of thing. And that was certainly coming through on the batch 1. But we do have slightly older stock being used for the batch 2 as well. And it'd be really interesting to see whether that does make a difference or not. And obviously we're dealing with cask finishing. So as I mentioned, there is no peated barley being used. So Joe and his team don't have any control, in essence, as to what the smoky element is going to be like. They're not using the peated barley themselves. They're not able to kind of go to a malting house, or if they were malting it themselves, and go, right, we want kind of that level of ppm, and therefore the whiskey will taste like this, and we're going to make it consistently. You're still dealing with the vagaries of casks, the kind of weird alchemy that goes on, that even though we have lots of information about what goes on during cask maturation, there is this weird mystery still going on, that you can put the same new make spirit in the same cask, pretty much from the same tree, in 2 different casks, and they're still going to taste slightly different. So then the influence of the peated whiskey that was in that cask then coming through onto the Filey Bay is going to have a factor that's somewhat unknown. And although there is a number of casks being used in the finishing process that Joe is then blended together, there is always the risk that it's going to be markedly different from the batch 1. So let's find out if that's the case. So that was the batch 2. This is the batch 1. Don't swap hand, right? Batch 1, batch 2. In terms of colour, very little to tell between the two. I mean, to be honest, I'm not bothered about colour. Some people are, but I really couldn't give a monkeys about what it looks like. You know, I've had certain people go, oh, well, the darker it is, the peatier it is. No, that's not the case. No colouring's added all of this lot, but, you know, in terms of the colour difference, it's not like if batch 2 was darker, I'd be going, oh, well, this is going to be absolutely different, and oh, I'm not going to like it, and all this lot, whatever. So, anyway, let's start with batch 1, and let's see how we go with that. So, on the nose, that light smokiness coming through. Again, sort of citrus cream. It's beautifully balanced, but it's very gentle. And the smokiness that's there, it's almost like a slight wood smoke. Dying embers of a bonfire. That sort of feel, that slightly ashy feel. A touch of salt on there as well. Okay, so the batch 2. Interesting, slightly more pronounced actually. The baseline aromas, the type of smokiness that's in it, is still there. There's slightly less of the creaminess, slightly less of that lemon puff, lemon cream feel on the batch 2 than there is on the batch 1. The smoke element is a little bit more forward, not by a massive amount, but it's definitely a bit more pronounced. Again, ashy, embers of a bonfire. Slightly more astringent, but astringent almost does it a disservice, because it's that the smokiness that's there is just slightly more intense. What was the saltiness on the batch 1 is more of a slight pepperiness on the batch 2. So straight away on the nose, there is not a massive difference, but there's more of a peated element, which people might be looking for on the batch 2. Right, batch 1, palate-wise. So initially, there's that classic house style of what is now the classic style of Filey Bay. Lemon cream, slightly biscuity, light, delicate, and then the smoke comes in kind of halfway through and is there on the finish. It's a soft smoke, again, slightly ashy, embers of a fire, but it works incredibly well with the citrus cream feel. It's soft, it's delicate, it's complex. The finish draws on for quite a while, but it's very gentle. It's very welcoming, but it's delicate, it's soft, it's fruity. And when I tried batch 1 to start with, I love the soft complexity that's there, but I do recognise that some people want more. They want more of that smokiness. You know, it really is a case of, well, I want peat coming through to it. But I love that subtlety, the subtle kind of harmony of flavours that are going on there. Right, so batch 2. Straight away, more intensity. Now, we're not talking bang, you're drinking an Ardbeg 10-year-old, but instantly there is more of a smoke element. The lemon cream, citrus cream feel that's on the batch 1, that's there up front, is there, but very much more in the background. And here we have much more of a smoked oak note coming through. There's more of a bite. There's more of a kind of a sort of intensity in there. Now, it's still not, I wouldn't call it heavily peated by any stretch of the imagination, but this comes across as a lightly peated whiskey, even though we're talking cask finish rather than peated barley that the distillery are using. This comes across as lightly peated, Bunnahabhain, that sort of feel. This is more kind of a medium peat level. This is not quite as intense as Kalila or Bamor, but getting to that stage. This, for me, the batch 1 is more kind of like a Bunnahabhain, soft, slightly sweet peat. This is getting more along the scale towards a Bamor and a Kalila, but maybe not quite hitting that intensity. Strangely, although I'm absolutely positive that batch 2 has older whiskey stock in before they put it into the casks for finishing than batch 1, if I was trying them blind and saying, right, which is the younger whiskey and which is the older, I'd actually put the batch 2 as younger whiskey with the batch 1 being older, simply because of the softer notes, the softer complexity that's in the batch 1, whereas the batch 2 it has more of a vigor to it, a more youthfulness. It feels younger because it feels like there's more bite, but it has more of that smoky element that I think people actually want. And I do think what I like about them is the fact that they are markedly different between the two, batch to batch. And I actually think that if you've tried the peated finish batch 1 and it wasn't enough for you, this is definitely getting to that stage. It's not massively intense, but it certainly has more of a smoky element that I think a number of drinkers were looking for from the first one. Yeah, it's definitely got... Now, that lemony creaminess is still there. It's pushed down a bit. It still works really, really well with that smokiness. That slightly dry, slightly ashy, burning embers of a bonfire. No medicinal element here. And I think if it did have a medicinal element, it might potentially be not quite working so well, not quite balancing so well with the citrus notes. But it's still excellent. It's still such a good combination of flavours. The finish, again, still goes on, arguably slightly longer because this has more intensity. But that combination of kind of citrus fruit, cream, smoke, soft smoke still, just works absolutely brilliantly. And it really comes across that the casks that he used for the finishing had more to give. They were, maybe it was a set of Kilchoman whiskey that had been in those casks that had actually been slightly higher peat levels than the ones that were used for the batch 1. I don't know, but they seem to have had more of an impact. There is more of a peated note in here. I'm wondering if that's a deliberate move by Joe, following feedback from people going, well, the peated finish, yes, it had some smokiness on it, but actually we want a bit more. And the general consensus was, can we have some more smoky element without going too overboard? Now, however long it takes for batch 3 to come out, it will be really interesting to see whether that develops even further. Because to be honest, I think the house style of Filey Bay, that kind of light, delicate citrus cream, lemon puff biscuits is what I always kind of liken it to. I do wonder if at a point of being involved with either peated barley or peated casks, it's so delicate that it will just get overblown by a smokiness. And actually you don't want to go too far. You know, if this gets any more intense, you're just going to lose that kind of Filey Bay element of it. But it feels like we are still moving in a really good direction and the balance still works absolutely fantastic. Yeah, it does still really work. There is still, you get the Filey Bay element, but you get this element of smoke and peat and earthiness and spiciness and all sorts of things going on. So is it better than batch 1? No, it's as good. And batch 1 was fantastic, and this is fantastic. And what I love about this is that this is moving in a direction. It's taking things slightly differently. in a direction that I think a lot of people will really like. Peated whiskey drinkers, I think, will actually, if you were to try the two side by side, prefer batch 2. I love batch 1 for its subtlety, its subtle complexity that's there. I have a feeling that more drinkers will prefer batch 2 because it's got a bit more oomph. How much more oomph it can take, if that's even a turn of phrase, would be very interesting to find out. You know, if you go for like a really kind of like really intense smokiness, is it just going to be too much? Are you just going to kind of lose the character of Spirit of Yorkshire in amongst all the smoke? Now, I've got a little bit of batch 1 left that I'm going to finish off. I'm not going to let go to waste because I think it's absolutely fantastic. But at the time of recording, this will launch the day after tomorrow. So Friday, June 9th? What date are we on? 10th is when this officially launches. I have stock in already. It's exactly the same price as all the other finishes, $59.99, which you should find across the board wherever it is. But it is available from me. And at the moment, I have stock and there are still stocks available. But as we know from batch 1, there is a limited number of these. I don't know how many exactly there are, but they did run out. And it's been at least 6 months now since I've had any peated finish in. So I'm not saying get it before it's gone, it's going to go next week, but it will go eventually, and this is a fantastic whiskey. So www.spiritspecialist.com, UK nationwide delivery is available. I do still have the remainder of this that's available if you want to come in the shop and try it before you buy it. But it is brilliant if you like peated whiskies, if you like Kalila, if you like Bamor, if you like that kind of like medium peated whiskies where it's got that complexity that just lifts all the flavours, and you want something incredibly well balanced, I highly, highly recommend this. If I didn't highly recommend it, I wouldn't have it on the shelf. That's me done. I shall see you in the next video. Cheers.